name's Penny, and today I'm going to be wrapping up all the books that I read in August. And I'll be doing this as a book battle, which is how I've been doing my wrap-ups recently. Basically, we pair up all the books that I've read and then we battle them against each other until we come up with the champion of the month. This month I only read 11 books, and I say only, 11 books is amazing for a month, but the last few months I have been reading about double that, but I did want to calm things down and read at a more realistic reading pace, especially because I'm going to be going back to work soon, so I need to not spend all my time reading. Unfortunately. So with this month's book battle, I have divided it into different groupings. Firstly, we have a little fantasy section with the lower part being YA and middle grade fantasies. Then we've got a science fiction section, and again I've separated out the YA. And then there's a couple of books that are sort of fantasy, sort of sci-fi, sort of weird. One of them's sort of horror. They don't really fit into a category, so I just put them together. And I will leave timestamps down below if you want to jump to a particular part of the book battle. But let's get into round one. Our first book battle is between two books from the same series. I read the first two books from the Arc of the Scythes series by Neil Shusterman. So that is Scythe by Neil Shusterman up against Thunderhead by Neil Shusterman. This series is set in a supposedly perfect future where society has solved all its problems, including death, but because people no longer die, they do have a problem with overpopulation, and to deal with this they've created these people called scythes whose job are to pick people to die. Now, as someone who does have a particular interest in the idea of living forever, I really had high hopes going into the first book of this series, but in the end I just felt like everything was very underdeveloped. And I know it's a YA book. I don't think that's an excuse. There's plenty of YA books that take these kind of concepts and develop them really well. I didn't think that it was ever believable that this was some kind of utopian, because there was no real exploration of what solving some of these world problems would really mean in terms of how it changed society. And even when it did talk about that, the ways that it had changed society didn't really make sense. In fact, the scythes themselves don't really make sense. Like, why on earth would they decide to let the scythes kill people in whatever way they want, rather than just having some kind of mandated painless way to die? I don't know. It never even tried to explain that. The characters as well were really underdeveloped. There's a romantic relationship where they're basically willing to give up their lives for each other, but there was no foundation set for that relationship at all. And so the motivations of all the different characters just didn't really make sense, and so their actions didn't make sense. I found the plot to be really boring and predictable, and there is an AI character in this, the Thunderhead, who rules the world, and I thought that was really interesting, but in this first book it was barely even touched on, and so overall I just ended up really disappointed in Scythe. However, then I moved on to Thunderhead, and I will say I think the plot of Thunderhead was a lot more interesting. It wasn't based on these relationships that had no foundation, and the characters were a little bit more developed. I would still say that the world building was pretty mediocre, and there were a lot of ideas that I didn't think made sense at all. But still, the way that everything came together in the end made me really interested to pick up the third book, because I think there's going to be some really interesting things with the AI. And to me, that's probably the most interesting thing in the story. I don't think I've ever really been that interested in the scythes themselves, because they just don't make sense to me. Anyway, I'm sure you can tell that for this battle, I'm going to put Thunderhead through to the next round. I still think it was somewhat flawed, but it was better than the first book. Then for the next battle, we have Lament by Maggie Stiefvater up against Vampire Mountain by Darren Shan. So Lament is actually Maggie Stiefvater's debut. It's a dark fairy story, although it's not really that dark. I certainly think there are darker YA fairy stories out there, and if anything I would compare this to Twilight, because it was very similar. We have this young girl who's quite unsure of herself, and then she meets this kind of dark and mysterious non-human who's kind of dangerous, and then we have some kind of romance. But I did think that the whole fairy aspect was quite interesting. It incorporated music in quite an interesting way, which, I mean, that and the inclusion of certain cars in the story were really the only parts that had that Maggie Stiefvater feel. So if you haven't read any Maggie Stiefvater, she has a very distinctive writing style. The way she writes things is just very lyrical and strange, but this didn't really have much of that at all, which I was somewhat disappointed in, but it was interesting to see how her writing has evolved over time. I definitely don't think things were always well explained, so that's one thing that she has improved on. And the romance as well seemed like a little bit of a leap, so she's improved in that as well. Also, like, the protagonist believes in fairies very quickly, which I never quite believed in either. Then we have Vampire Mountain. This is the 4th book in the Cirque du Freak series, which is just a fun middle grade, maybe on the border of YA. We're following this boy who has become a half vampire, and in this one he's going to this big vampire meeting at the top of Vampire Mountain. They also seem to be at the start of a war with the Vampanese. So you can see there's just a lot of silly-ish kind of concepts, but at the same time, it's probably quite dark for middle grade / young adult fantasy. Personally, I was very frustrated when this book ended because it ended on a complete cliffhanger. I thought that thing that was going to happen in the end was going to be included in the book, and then it said to be continued. The audiobooks for this series are only about 4 hours long, so it's very short, and I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think that's probably a good length for middle grade, but I do almost feel like I just need to binge the whole series so that I can get through it, rather than reading it in these tiny little pieces. Another criticism that I do have is that our main character is a half vampire, and he hasn't really been a vampire for that long, but he often seems to be able to do things or best these other vampires who have been vampires for hundreds of years, and that's not entirely believable. Still, the series is just a lot of fun, and I think you have to just not take that too seriously. Now, in terms of which book should win this battle, I had to resort to my spreadsheet for this one, but I think in the end, the plot of Lament was just more interesting, probably just because it's a longer book, so there was more to it. And I also think the ideas about how the fairy world worked were a lot more developed and a lot more unique than some of the ideas about how the vampires work in Cirque du Freak. But again, I just feel like it comes down to Vampire Mountain being so short. But regardless, I'm going to put Lament through to the next round. Then we have another couple of YA fantasy. So we've got Charmcaster by Sebastian de Castell up against The Bronze Key by Holly Black and Cassandra Clare. So firstly, Charmcaster. This is the 3rd book in the Spellslinger series. We've got this boy named Cullen who, in the 1st book, he was just lining up for his magic exams when his magic stopped working, and he ended up basically having to leave town and make his own way. But I do feel like this series has come so far from the 1st book. Every book seems to be adding another layer to the magic. We're getting more characters added to the story. Characters from earlier books keep coming back. The world just keeps expanding and expanding. And in this 3rd book, there was so much happening. I honestly kept thinking that I must be near the end because things were so exciting, and then there would be more to the story. Also, I think the main character, Cullen, is becoming more and more interesting. In the 1st book, I didn't like him that much, and I was a little bit about whether he lived or died, but now he's starting to learn some of the Argosy tricks. So he's got this mentor teaching him a little bit about life, and I really like what he's learning and how he's applying those ideas. I will say that some of the sections, especially the fight scenes, seem a little bit drawn out, and as well, in the first couple of books, what I liked the most was the squirrel cat and his humor, but I'll admit that I'm getting a little bit bored of it now, and I kind of just want to move on from that. Still, because there is so much going on in this series now, I'm really excited to continue. Next, we have The Bronze Key, which is another 3rd book in the series. This is the 3rd book in the Magisterium series, and this one's main character's name is Callum? In the Spellslinger series, his name is Cullen. It's very confusing, but they aren't that similar in the actual stories. So in The Bronze Key, we're following this boy named Cole who has ended up going to magic school. In the 1st book, he's actually trying not to get into magic school because his father has told him that magic school is not a good place. But By the third book, he's learned a lot more about the world, and he's quite involved in fighting against this great evil who used chaos magic back in the day and caused a lot of problems. I really liked in this book how they started exploring that chaos magic a little bit more and looking at how it linked into soul magic. I also thought this book did a really good job of laying a bunch of clues that I didn't realize until the end how they were all gonna fit together. And the ending was super exciting, for me at least, and this is another one where I am looking forward to continuing the series. I do think there were a few bits that just didn't really make sense, particularly one bit where an adult is hiding some major secret under her bed and they use that to guess a password, even though this woman who's hiding things under her bed and setting passwords that people would be able to guess is supposed to be some kind of expert security person. But this is quite young YA fantasy, so I think you can overlook a few things like that. And I am just finding the series to be quite fun. So overall, I am enjoying that one as well, which makes this battle more difficult. Looking at the pictures that I've picked for these two books, I really want to go with the Bronze Key just because the cover's much prettier. I don't really like the style of the Spellslinger covers, but that's not a good reason. I feel like I'm probably more emotionally invested in the story of the Bronze Key. However, I also think that the plot of Charmcaster is a lot more interesting. There's a lot more going on. It's just a lot smarter. So for that reason, I think I will probably put Charmcaster through to the next round. Okay, so now we're going to move on to round 2 with the two books that didn't really fit into any single category, and that is Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant up against The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. So I keep calling Rolling in the Deep the prequel to Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, but calling something a prequel I feel like also almost implies that it was written after Into the Drowning Deep, and I don't think that's the right way to think about this book at all. This was a novella that was written before Into the Drowning Deep, and it kind of sets up a lot of the ideas that were explored a lot further into the Drowning Deep. Because I read Into the Drowning Deep first, I do feel like Rolling in the Deep didn't really add anything particularly to the story, but given that it was written first, it's not really fair to expect it to do that. So this book is about this expedition out to try and find mermaids, but it's funded by this entertainment company, so basically they're going to set it up so that it looks like they found mermaids regardless of what actually happens. They do have a bunch of actual scientists doing actual science on the ship, but it's reality TV. They're trying to hype everything up and make it look a lot more dramatic than it is. That is until they do actually find mermaids, and they're not very friendly. In Into the Drowning Deep, we're following a second expedition that then comes back to try and figure out what happened to the first expedition. No one really believes that they were attacked by mermaids, even though there is footage that shows just that happening. So I did enjoy Rolling in the Deep, but as I said, it doesn't really add that much to the fuller novel, and I would probably say that you're better off just to read the full novel, and you don't necessarily need to read Rolling in the Deep unless you are particularly interested. It's super short and it doesn't really get scary until about the last 20 pages out of the 120 pages of the book. Also, there are a lot of characters, and that first part of the book is really just introducing all those different characters and helping you to understand their role on the ship. But given that right from the beginning you know that they're all dead by the end of the book, it's kind of hard to feel invested in getting to know those characters. So I enjoyed it. It was an okay reading experience, but I did prefer Into the Drowning Deep. So then we've got The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin, and this was a super weird book. Essentially, the city of New York is about to gain a soul, and what that means is there is going to be a person representing this city, except in this particular case, there is in fact a different person representing each different section of the city. And so we're following all these different people as they come together and try to fight this greater evil that is trying to stop New York from gaining its consciousness. There's also some other cities, avatars that come to try and help New York with its birth. And honestly, there were just so many concepts in this story that I thought were amazing. I did like most of the characters, although I will say because each character is based on the stereotypes of the different areas of New York, and I don't really have that much knowledge of the different areas of New York or what those stereotypes really are in real life. So it was hard for me to tell whether the way the stereotypes were being used was like in a clever way that would like make people think, or whether it was being done in a harmful way that really reinforces those stereotypes, if you know what I mean. I think any stereotype really has the tendency to be harmful and misleading, and so I'm still not sure how I feel about that. But I did think all the different characters were very diverse and interesting people, so perhaps it was okay. I mean, I have to put my trust in N.K. Jemisin as a black woman who I believe comes from New York to have a much better idea about that than me. But I will also say that I was somewhat dissatisfied with the ending because I was really looking forward to everything coming together, but some things were left open because it turns out this is going to be the first book in a series, so we're going to have to wait for future books to find out what happens with a few of the things that are actually the things that I was most interested in this book. Anyway, regardless, even though I did have a few bits that I wasn't entirely satisfied with, just some of the parts of this book were amazing and so creative and so unique. It made it an amazing reading experience. And for that reason, I'm sure you can tell that in this battle, I'm going to put The City We Became through to the next round. Then next we have The Fated Sky by Mary Robinette Kowal up against Thunderhead by Neil Shusterman. So The Fated Sky is the second book in the Lady Astronaut series. In the first book, there is a meteor that hits the Earth, and because of that, they know they need to accelerate their space program because it's caused several climate changes, which means Earth probably won't be habitable in the next couple of decades. And we're following this Jewish woman who is trying to get herself included in the astronaut program. So she's fighting against quite a lot of sexism. She also suffers from anxiety, and there is also quite a strong theme in both of these books about racism. I think this was much stronger in the second book, where the people of color involved in the space program are being accused of sabotaging it, and they're also having to really fight for their place in the program. In the second book, we're traveling to Mars. So in the first one, they were trying to get to the moon, and I would say most of the story was just about the process before they left for the moon. The second book is mostly the actual trip to Mars. And because of that, I feel like a lot of it got really bogged down in these details about the space process. And while it seems somewhat ridiculous to be complaining that a science fiction book about going to Mars had too much spacey stuff in it, that was my main criticism. It did make things seem very authentic, so I do think it was important that some of it was included, but I think it just went a little bit overboard. Although, if you're really interested in space stuff, you'll probably enjoy that aspect. I will also say I thought the characters were really well developed. They seemed very realistic. All the different interpersonal issues, I think, really emphasize the point that everyone has different prejudices and nobody is perfect. But also that some people do have privilege, and it's kind of looking at how you can use that privilege in a good way and avoid using it in a harmful way. So putting it up against Thunderhead by Neil Shusterman, I do think that the plot in Thunderhead was a little bit more interesting. There were a few twists and turns. The plot of The Fated Sky is primarily just we're going to Mars. There's a few things along the way, but none of them were particularly tricksy, although I mean I definitely cried a lot more in The Fated Sky. Yes, I'd definitely say I was much more emotionally attached to The Fated Sky, and just because I think the themes and the issues addressed in The Fated Sky were so much more important and addressed in such a great way, I think I'll put The Fated Sky through to the next round because I do really recommend it. Okay, so now we're up to our adult fantasy battle. This is The Desert Spear by Peter V. Brett up against Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. So The Desert Spear is the second book in the demon cycle. This is set in a world where whenever the sun goes down, these demons come out. There's all sorts of different demons like wood demons, fire demons, wind demons, and they're all slightly different. And the people of this world have developed these wards, so like these symbols that they can draw on buildings or weapons or sometimes even people, and those wards push the demons away and cause them pain. And we're following a bunch of different characters that are beginning to get involved in a bigger effort to get rid of these demons. What I will say is that this book and the first one actually are quite weirdly structured. It's written from multiple perspectives, so we change between following different characters, but it tends to stay with a particular character for so long that you almost forget that there's other parts of the story going on. About the first third of the book was just following one character, and the events in that first third of the book were actually happening at the same time as the events in the first book. So I really feel like that part should have actually been in the first book, even though then the first book would have been way too long. So I don't know how that works out. As well, I think this book in particular was really violent, including like rape and murder in just ways that didn't really seem necessary. And I think a lot of that could have been cut out, which would have helped with the length issue. A lot of the character relationships feel quite rushed and underdeveloped, but there were some interesting developments in terms of how the demons work and what we know about the demons, and that's something I'm really interested to explore further in this series. There's also a character who is able to like prophesize the future, and I really would have liked to have seen more done with that character, so possibly that will happen in future books. I just feel like overall, I'm not sure how I feel about this series, but I do think the world is really interesting, and so I'm hoping that the next 3 books of the series will improve as Peter V. Brett developed his writing abilities. And I am listening to these books on audiobooks, so that means that I am willing to take a bit of a risk, because audiobooks are a little bit easier to get through. Then we've got Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. Everyone is saying this is similar to a D&D campaign, which I would say is true. We've got a band of mercenaries who used to be really famous and successful, but now they're all older, they've split off, they've got their families, but the daughter of one of these men has gone missing, and so he's trying to get the band back together to go after her. Now I will say it takes about half the book for them to actually get the band back together, and I was expecting a lot more of the actual quest. And a lot of people say that they really enjoy the humor of this, and while I can see that it is sort of funny, to me it's more the kind of humor that seems funny in the moment, but when you're reading it in a book, I'm not sure that that kind of humor translates, or at least it doesn't translate to me. So I was a bit disappointed in that. I found there were quite a lot of info dumps about the world building, and then when you later actually needed that information, it would repeat it, which I found a bit frustrating. A lot of the plot points were quite predictable to me, and I never really felt that connected to the characters. But that said, I did feel like the final battle kind of brought things together, and I did find that somewhat satisfying. So it wasn't completely terrible, but just because it had been so hyped, I was somewhat disappointed. So then, putting this up against The Desert Spear, I actually find this quite difficult, because I feel like, for me, both these books had quite a lot of flaws, but there were elements that kept me interested, and so for both these books I probably am going to continue the series, but I'm probably going to do both via audiobook, because I do feel like there is a risk that I won't enjoy the next books in either series. I mean, I definitely think the world building in The Desert Spear was a lot stronger, but I would also probably say that the actual writing of Kings of the Wild was better, and in general I think that most people would probably enjoy Kings of the Wild better. So at least until I've read more books in the Demon Cycle series, I think I'm going to put Kings of the Wild through to the next round. Then we've got Lament by Maggie Stiefvater up against Charmcaster by Sebastian G. Castell. So I've talked about both of these already, and I think probably I just need to put Charmcaster through to the next round, because even though I did enjoy Lament, overall I just think that Charmcaster had a better plot and the writing was probably better. I probably enjoyed some of the ideas in Lament better, but I don't think they were very well explained. So definitely Charmcaster through to the next round. Alright, so now we're on to the semi-finals. First up, we've got The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin up against The Fated Sky by Mary Robinette Kowal. So The City We Became was just so unique and so creative, and it had such amazing concepts. I also think it did look at some of the same themes as The Fated Sky, although I still think overall The Fated Sky was a better look into those ideas, but just the world of The Fated Sky could never compare to the world that N.K. Jemisin has created in The City We Became. So I'm going to put The City We Became through to the next round. Then we have Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eam up against Charmcaster by Sebastian de Castell. Now, in their own way, both of these series are quite hyped, but personally, I just found the ideas and the world of Charmcaster to be a lot more interesting. I didn't feel particularly attached to the characters in either book, but I'm starting to get attached to Kellen in Spellslinger. So I'm going to put Charmcaster through to the next round. And now we're up to the finals, which means we're going to be picking the champion of the month. And we've got The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin up against Charmcaster by Sebastian de Castell. And I think you can probably guess which one I'm going to go for. I'm going to choose The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin as the champion. Just as I said, it was such a unique idea, and there were certain sentences that I read and I just knew that in any other context those sentences would never make sense. But because of the world that N.K. Jemisin had created, these sentences were amazing. Just some of the ideas she was able to explore because of this world that she's created was so cool. And because of that, was definitely my favorite book of the month. So if you haven't read The City We Became, I definitely recommend it. Do be aware though that it is only the first book in a series, so not everything gets wrapped up. So do let me know if you have read any of the books that I talked about today, because I would love to talk with you more about them down in the comments. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you next time.